When I was 12, I found something under my bed that no one believed. It happened while I was counting my marble collection. One of them, a tiger's eye, rolled under the bed. Without thinking, I reached out to get it and felt someone's hand. Up until that moment, I had only touched my parents' hands as a child, and I immediately realized that it was a human hand. The icy cold of someone else's fingers made me recoil, and I backed into the corner of the room. After my fear subsided a little, I dropped to all fours and looked under the bed. What I saw will never be forgotten. Eyes. The brightest, bluest eyes I had ever seen in my life. And then everything seemed to go dark, and I woke up on the floor, surrounded by the worried faces of my parents. My sister, Jill, explained that I had screamed and fainted. As soon as I finally came to my senses, the memory of what had happened crashed down on me like an avalanche. I claimed that there was a body under the bed. As expected, my parents decided that it was just nonsense. "You dreamed it," they said. But I was persistent, and eventually they agreed to check. I waited on the couch, covering my head with my hands. I was sure that I was about to hear my mother scream, but nothing of the sort happened. I carefully opened my eyes and saw my parents. They looked more annoyed than worried. They explained to me that I had imagined it, and that was it. My father was a stern man and did not tolerate nonsense. Their reaction made me doubt, what if it really was a dream? That evening, I avoided my room until the last minute. But when it was time to go to bed, there was no point in protesting. My knees were shaking, my breathing was ragged, but I went in. The room looked normal. Everything was as always. Even the smell was familiar. This realization brought relief. Fatigue took over. I quickly changed into my pajamas. Sleep came unexpectedly easily, but it was restless. I tossed and turned, seeing nightmares in which those same blue eyes looked at me from everywhere. At dawn, I woke up with a feeling of heaviness in my chest. I had to make sure that I had just dreamed all this. Shaking, I took the flashlight from the nightstand, turned it on, and looked under the bed again. This time, I did not scream or faint. I just froze. She was there. The same woman with bright blue eyes, but now her body was covered in blood and contorted in unnatural positions. In shock, I slowly crawled back and climbed onto the bed, unable to scream or cry. Later, at breakfast, my father noticed my tired appearance. My sister mockingly compared me to dirt, but I was in no mood for jokes. I told him about the woman again, but my father cut me off rudely. "Those silly pranks," he said. My silence guaranteed peace in the house. However, at school I confided in my best friend Joey. Joey, who loved everything mystical, immediately believed me. "It's a ghost," he concluded. But I objected that I could feel her hand. Joey explained that not all spirits are immaterial, and we decided that it was a soul stuck between worlds. Returning home, I decided to take another look. It was not easy. In addition to the disgusting appearance of her body, there was a suffocating smell of decomposition. It became unbearable for me. Then I began to notice that the nightmares were becoming more vivid. In my dreams, the woman was running through the forest, pursued by someone. Later I realized she was showing me her last minutes. When I found the strength to look under the bed again a couple of weeks later, she was gone. But this story didn't end the way I expected. The next day at school, my sister and I were called to the principal's office. We were told that my father had been arrested for the murder of a woman whose body had been found in the woods. Later, I saw her picture on the TV screen. The same girl with blue eyes. Her name was Anna. She chose me to tell her story. And although her life had ended tragically, I felt that her soul had finally found peace. The days following my father's arrest were chaotic. My mother cried constantly, my sister withdrew into herself, and I couldn't figure out what I was feeling. My father had always been strict, sometimes even cruel, but a murderer. The thought was beyond me. I tried to remember if there were any signs I'd ignored before, but nothing concrete came to mind. The police came to our house several times, asking questions and checking everything. They took away scraps of blood-soaked cloth from under the bed that I hadn't noticed before. I had to explain why I hadn't reported it right away. The policeman recording my statement looked incredulous, but said nothing. A few weeks later, the trial began. Journalists filled the street outside the courthouse, and my father's face flashed across the TV screen every night. The accusation was relentless, aggravated murder. All the evidence pointed to him, and at some point I stopped doubting. He really could have done it. However, one thing was bothering me. In my dreams, Anna, as I now called the girl, always looked scared, but not because of my father. Someone else was chasing her. I decided to share this with Joey, and he immediately offered his theory. Maybe the real killer was still at large, and my father was just framed. This thought was frightening, but at the same time hopeful. If it was true, then I could help find the real criminal. That same evening, I went to bed again with the sole purpose of seeing her. I did not know how it worked, but I was sure that Anna would show me something important. The dream came almost immediately. I found myself again in the forest where Anna had escaped. This time I saw more details. A man in a dark jacket with a hood was chasing her. His face remained indistinguishable, as if hidden by a thick fog. But one detail struck me: a silver cross pendant that flickered around his neck. I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling a strange mixture of fear and determination. This pendant was my only lead. I shared what I had seen with Joey, and we began searching the internet. It turned out that such a pendant was part of a limited collection that was sold in only a few stores. It was not something unique, but it gave at least a faint hope that we were on the right track. In the following days, I began to communicate more with the police. I told the detective in charge of the case about my dreams, but he dismissed them, deciding that they were a figment of my imagination. Then I decided to take the extreme step. I went to the place where Anna's body was found. The forest turned out to be much darker than I expected. The branches of the trees bent as if they were trying to block the way, and the sounds of the forest seemed too loud. I barely found the courage to go there. But as I went deeper into the thicket, I noticed something shiny on the ground. Coming closer, I saw that very pendant. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. This was not just a random find. I was sure that the pendant belonged to that man from my dream. I hurried out of the forest, clutching the pendant in my hand as if I was afraid it would disappear. My head was spinning with thoughts. If this pendant belonged to the man from the dream, then it could be real evidence linked to the killer. But how to prove it? I couldn't just go to the police and say that I found it thanks to a vision. I showed the find to Joey. He looked at the pendant for a long time, then said, "We need to find out who bought such jewelry. The stores probably keep records." The idea seemed crazy, but this was our only chance. We started looking for information about this pendant. We managed to find a store that sold it a few years ago. I called there and, introducing myself as a journalist, asked if they had saved the details of the buyers. Luckily, the seller was sociable and said that the collection was sold in a limited edition, only 100 pieces. We wrote down the buyer's contacts for guarantee, he added. These words made me feel a surge of hope. We agreed to meet him in person to study the list. When I arrived at the store, I was handed an old, slightly tattered notebook. Among the names and addresses, one of the listed clients caught my eye. It was a man whose name I had heard before. He lived in our town, and as it turned out, was a neighbor of Anna's family. There were no more doubts. I knew I had to act quickly. When I returned home, I told my mother everything. She was silent for a long time and then said, "If you're right, this could save your father." But the next day, something unexpected happened. In the morning, the same man from the list came to our house. He looked worried and asked me if I had found anything in the forest. I felt my insides shrink with fear. "No," I answered, trying to appear calm. The man didn't believe me. His gaze lingered on my hands, and I realized that he suspected something. A few minutes later he left, but I was sure he would return. That same night I had another dream. This time Anna didn't run away. She stood in front of me and held a photograph of the same man with the pendant. His face was clear, and now I knew what he looked like. When I woke up, I knew I had to act immediately. Joey and I went to the police and handed over the pendant. I told them everything I had learned, but kept quiet about the dreams. The detective seemed intrigued. A few days later, the police arrested the man. It turned out that the pendant contained traces of his DNA, which matched the samples found at the crime scene. My father was free and a real killer was arrested. Even though justice had been served, I didn't feel any relief. Every time I fell asleep, I was afraid of having a new dream related to this terrible story. It seemed that nightmares would become my constant companion. My father returned home, but the joy of his release was overshadowed by the sense of loss that haunted our family. We had wasted a lot of time trying to prove his innocence. It was difficult for him to get used to freedom after months behind bars, and for me to the idea that dreams were the key to solving this mystery. A few weeks later, I decided to return to that forest to try to understand my feelings. The forest was as gloomy and mysterious as the first time. I reached the place where I found the pendant and stopped. My soul felt lighter, as if the forest no longer held sinister secrets. Unexpectedly, there was a rustle behind me. I turned around sharply and saw a girl. Her figure was blurry, as if it were something unreal. She looked at me with a slight smile. It was Anna. "Thank you," she whispered, and her voice echoed. I froze, unable to say anything. The girl slowly dissolved into the air, leaving behind only a light breeze. I stood there, realizing that this was a farewell. When I returned home, I felt a strange relief. It seemed that Anna had found peace, and with her I had. Now I knew sometimes dreams come for a reason. They can be a bridge between our world and what lies beyond it. Since then, I no longer dreamed about the past. My life returned to its usual course, but I never forgot that story. It became a lesson for me. You need to listen to your heart and not be afraid to go towards the unknown, even if it looks scary.